In the last lesson, we touched on effects that can slow down your render, like depth of field blur and motion blur. Sure, if you have a powerful computer, you can bake in those blurs right into your render. But what happens if your client doesn't like the amount of depth of field blur? And what if a client wants less reflections on a material? Well, you'd have to re-render the entire sequence, which can take hours or even days. So how do you set up your renders for maximum flexibility where you can quickly change aspects of your render in post? Well, that's where rendering with AOVs or arbitrary output variables come in. So AOVs allow you a ton of flexibility to change things in compositing apps like After Effects. Using them, you can render out many aspects of your scene into all of these different passes, like the reflection passes and depth passes and motion vector passes that allow you to control motion blur and depth of field blurs. Rendering passes allow you to control various aspects of your render in post, ensuring you only have to render out of Cinema 4D once. So we're talking about a level of control where you can render out specific materials, a specific aspect or layer of a material, color information, illumination from individual lights, and much more. So for maximum flexibility to change things and adjust things in comps, AOVs are going to be the way to go. So let's go and dive in and cover all things compositing inside of Cinema 4D and After Effects. All right, so here is the scene we are going to be, we're going to animate this and render this. You can see there's already some animation in here of this laptop opening. We got this nice little office scene. We got the official Gus the Pug Wacom pen holder, which now that I made it, I actually want one in real life. But we're going to make this look a little bit more interesting. Going to add a nice little camera move. We're transitioning from talking about camera moves. I figure I'd give you one other little tip for how you can create a very simple camera rig that can help you animate a little bit more complex moves. And then we'll talk about different ways you can get your image out of Cinema 4D and do a little post work in After Effects. So let's add a nice little smooth camera move. And I already got my redshift camera here. The focal length is 80 millimeters, and I am animating and rendering out of 24 frames per second there. So you can see if I hit Command and Control D, I also have the frames per second at 24 frames per second here in my project as well. So remember, you need both things to be the same, your project and then what you're rendering out. Those frame rates need to match, okay? So we have a fairly boring animation right now. Let's add a nice little camera move to get a little bit more interest. Don't need to do anything crazy. And maybe I just want like a little, maybe like a nice little tilt up or down, or maybe a little orbit. So what I'm going to do is show you a nice little simple rig that's called a 2-node camera. And basically what it does is it just helps you separate out two different objects. So a target object and the camera. So wherever you can basically set up where the camera is looking at or pointing at and what the camera is orbiting around. Two simple things. So we are going to have a target object, and I don't want to choose a target object that is an object in the scene. I want to have flexibility, so I'm going to create a null. Okay, so there's our null right there, and I'm just going to rename this target, or target, as they say in France, and then we're going to apply a target tag on the redshift camera. So this camera is always pointing at that target. So if I right click, go to animation tags, target, we get the target tag, throw the target in the target tab object, and you can see that everything just snapped, okay? So if I go to my 4-up view, let's do that again. Let me just clear this out. So if I click on this little downward arrow and hit clear, and I'll just get my camera back to close to where it was and show you what happens again. So click on the target tag, drag and drop that in there. Boom, you can see that it kind of shifted. You can see in these other views what kind of happened as well. So what happens now is I can move this target null and my camera will be aiming at that null, okay? So if I wanted to create a simple tilt, I could just animate this null moving up or down. If I wanted to do a pan, I can just go and move this left or right along the x-axis. So this allows you to make these very simple camera moves very easily. Now, if you wanted to do some kind of orbit, what you could do is select the camera and animate the camera going up or down, okay? So I think what I want to do is just create a nice little camera move that is maybe moving. So the laptop's is opening up. Okay, so that's an upward movement. I think I might actually go and do the opposite and actually have this camera movement coming down. So we have like opposing, not opposing forces, but opposing movements. Okay, so we'll start from the top here and make sure we're at frame 0, go to coordinates, and we'll set keyframes. And the other great thing about this whole setup is that you don't have to deal with rotation keyframes if you don't want to, okay? So all the positional keyframes are being added to this camera, and then we'll go to the end, and we'll just move this down. And you can see there is some rotation happening, but the rotation is being driven because of the fact that we're actually, we're targeting and looking at that target null. So I'll set some more keyframes here, go to the first keyframe, or first frame, and you can see we got this nice little kind of orbit down for the most part there, looking good. And so at this point, we can use this target null to kind of fine tune where this, where the camera is looking at. So maybe we want to start from here. Again, I have my compositional helpers here so I can see, like, am I composing this right? So, you know, maybe I have, you know, the plants being the first part of this golden spiral, spiraling around, and the main point of focus is going to be the laptop, right? So I will set some keyframes for the target null, and then we'll go to the end. And at this point, like, I think everything is too centered up. So what I'll do is move the target tag up a little bit. So this table is kind of falling on this lower third line there. And so I'll set some new keyframes, and then I'll maybe even go to the camera and maybe move this out. Maybe I don't want it to angle down too much. And just move the target down like so. And so something like that is feeling pretty good. And so you notice that these camera move, or this singular camera move, is controlled by two objects. And we got this nice little, like, kind of like an orbit, but we're also kind of dollying back a little bit. And it just looks nice and smooth controlled. What I'm going to go do is go into the timeline and select the target null and the camera, and just make sure those are linear keyframes so we don't have the ease in, ease out there. One other tip for you, say you wanted to reverse it. Maybe you don't want it to kind of orbit down, you want it to orbit up. What you can do is select the tracks of your objects here, so the position tracks. You can then go to key and just say, okay, we just mirror this in the X. And so when I do that, you can see this is now kind of orbiting upwards. So basically, if I do that again, let me just show you the keyframes. So those are the keyframes. You can see the Y is going up. If I go to key and mirror X, that's basically just flipping it, mirroring it, okay? So just a little tip there if you wanted to try, you know, going up or down or up, you can do that very easily without having to select keyframes and, you know, move them around. You can just mirror them and flip them, okay? So this is looking good. Another tip I'll give you is if you wanted to actually have a true orbit where this is arcing up, because here's one of the problems with this setup is that this is kind of like a very linear line. It's not really arcing. So if you wanted a true arc motion, what you could do is, instead of, you know, animating the camera, you could go and, you know, duplicate this target, call this the parent, and then I'll delete the keyframes off here. So Command or Control Shift and click to remove those tracks. And then I'll place the camera under the parent. And now what this allows you to do is orbit up like this. And so you'll actually create a nice arcing motion. So whatever you want to do, I'm going to actually undo all that because this is such a subtle move that I don't even need to get into that kind of complexity there. And that's looking good. So we got our animation. Let's start talking about actually rendering here. So up until this point in this course, I have been telling you to render out as a PNG 16-bit and call it a day. And you have been checking your renders via the Redshift render view. So let's fire that up. So Redshift render view. And let me just go ahead and make this a little bigger and fire off that preview, the IPR, and this will start to do its thing. You can see I have a fill light, a gobo light that is going to be creating a really nice gobo shadow. Just wait for it. It's definitely worth the anticipation here. There we go. So you can see what we got in the scene. We got nice little paintings here behind some glass. We got another painting here. The Gus the Pug kind of treated as like a vinyl toy, so it's got some subsurface scattering there. This laptop actually has like an emissive texture on it. So I got a lot of different aspects of this scene. I got the gobo light, we got the nice shadows, gobo shadows there. And so you can see what's kind of going on in the scene. And so typically you would render out and call it a day. You wouldn't probably do much tweaking. I have introduced up until this point this little gear menu, and these are your post effects. And what these allow you to do is do basic post effects like color correction, adding a LUT or lookup table, adding bloom or glow, doing a simple curves adjustment. You can actually do that inside of Redshift and bake it in and not have to do any of that curve adjustment or anything in Photoshop or After Effects, right? So that's kind of the benefit of having these post effects right in here. And so if I open up my render settings and if I just go ahead and twirl down this optical, and basically what this optical menu here is basically just trying to get real filmic effects applied to your render so it looks a lot more realistic, okay? So you have things like exposure, which you can control on a film camera, right? So you can adjust that. And notice the moment I touched that, this post effects little checkbox entered or showed up in our render settings here. So this is an easy way if you wanted to render with post effects or render without post effects, you can just check this on or off and you'll see that'll actually adjust that right there. And so these are controlled per camera as well. So all these different optical settings. So if I went, and if you're not actually seeing the optical tab, it might be because you are looking through a different view. And so you might have the front view or perspective view or something like that. And you'll see that the optical menu is not there. So you just want to make sure that you are looking through the Redshift camera and you'll see that optical settings right here. So I'm just going to set this exposure back down to 0. You can see we have the white point, which again is also something that you can control in a real camera. And so basically what the white point does is controls what is white. And it actually controls, if you set this to a color, it controls what you remove from an image. So let's just say this has a cast of a little bit of yellow. So if I go and move this to yellow, you can actually see that I'm removing yellow and I'm actually gaining whatever color's on the opposite side of this color wheel. So if I really move this and I want like a blue tint to really cool everything down, you can just set this to, something over here that's on this side of the color wheel and it's opposite the cooler colors of the color wheel. And you can just adjust that and get a little purpley little cast. So this is very handy if maybe you have a light that is blasting yellow or something like that. You can go and remove a little bit of it and get a little bit more blue. Or if you want this to look a little more warm, just bring this down to the other side of the color wheel. And you can see that now we're actually removing those blues and replacing it with the color on the opposite side of the color wheel, which is that yellow. We can go a little bit more to orange. So it's all about what type of vibe do you want this to be? Do you want it to look cool or warm? Okay. So you can kind of play along with that. I think I'll go a little bit cool, just very subtle. Then we have things like vignetting, which is very simple. Typically, I won't bake in vignetting because this is kind of something that's easy to do in post. But if you just wanted to add a little bit, you can do it right in Redshift and you don't have to do it in post or anything like that. These aperture and stuff like that, again, just acts exactly like it would be in a real photo, a real camera or a film camera. So shutter speed. The more this is open, the brighter everything gets. The lower this is, the darker everything gets because you're underexposing things. Okay. The aperture, again, that controls your depth of field. Also controls how much light's being entered into the camera. Typically, I won't mess with any of that stuff. One thing that I typically will adjust is this tone mapping. And what tone mapping does is basically takes all of the overbright areas of your image and tones it down, hence tone mapping, right? And so nothing is overbright, nothing is overexposed. And so when you turn on the tone mapping, you can see all the overbright areas are toned down, but then you can bring back some of those highlights by upping this area, this little slider here, okay? And so this desaturate highlights, if you see on the actual, the laptop here, desaturate highlights is again just mimicking something that happens in real life. Usually anything that's super bright is going to get, or super saturated is going to get desaturated when it's filmed or taken a photo of. And so that is something that you can either leave on or turn off, turn on. Now this next area here is basically controlling all of the dimmer parts of your image. So if you really wanted to like crush the darker, dimmer areas, you can see that if you bring up this blacks level, you can see that we're really darkening all the dim areas that are not getting hit by light. And this threshold is basically controlling how much of your image, what's the threshold that would be considered that blacker area that you would really want to kind of be a part of this little slider that really crushes everything down, really makes it contrasty. So that's kind of what that is all about. And then we have saturation, which again is just controls the overall saturation of your image. And then we have things like bokeh. Again, that is stuff that you can actually control in the actual camera, control your depth of field, blur, stuff like that. Now, that is your optical settings. Again, the optical settings are basically there to make sure your render is not overexposed using the tone mapping and is more filmic, more realistic looking, okay? So the next thing I want to talk about is this background. I've covered this in the past, and basically what this does, if I hide my walls here from render and viewer, you can see that this, if you turn on this background, you can basically choose a color and that will be applied as your background. So if you just want a flat, it's almost like you're slapping your render on a layer with this color. There's no light contribution coming from it or anything like that. So if you want to just add a black background color onto your render, boom, this is what that controls, okay? You can also load up an image if you wanted to too by going in here, but I will not do that. And I'll check off that background. Let's turn back on our walls. Next up is color controls. Then we'll check that on to activate it. This allows you to add some contrast. This also is basically your curves adjustment. So you can click and get your little curve editor points, little spline editor points, and do your little S curve. You can go and control different color channels here. So just the blue, either remove it. You know, it's kind of like the white point where you're gonna remove or add in the color and really boost that color so you can get some cool blue hues and stuff like that. So this is what this color controls is controlling. So you don't have to, if you just want to do a simple curves adjustment, you don't got to go into any other app. You can do it all in Redshift. We'll turn that off. Next up is bloom. Actually, I'll keep that on and we'll turn on bloom. And this is basically your glow. So the threshold, the lower this is, the more it's going to use most of your image to actually apply a glow to. Here's the softness, kind of blurs it out. And then the intensity, so we can get this really cool, like dreamy vibe to this. Really bloomed out. And so this is kind of nice. You can adjust the tint if you want to tint your bloom, however many different colors you would want. So something, actually we should probably do like something like blues if we wanted to. And so you can kind of see what's going on there. Just that, so it's something like that. So that's what that is doing, the bloom, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to turn that off. Flare, actually I'll turn on bloom. Let's turn on flare because this is basically your lens flare. So if I bring the threshold down, you can see that little glint. This is if you want to really do your best J.J. Abrams impression where you really got your lens flare. Let's get our streaks. Let's go streaking. Let's add this in and let's see. You can kind of see, I want to make sure that you can see the lens flare there. Let's really up the bloom intensity and maybe adjust the contrast so we can really crank some of, there we go. Now you'll see some of the blooms and all that stuff. So there's the flare, the streaks, all the lens flare tails and streak number. You can really see what's going on there. So if you want to add your lens flares and stuff like that, this is where you can bake that in. Don't recommend you do that though. I very rarely mess with the flare or the bloom. Sometimes bloom, but definitely not the flare, definitely not the streak. I'll add all that stuff in post just to have some control. This is all baked in and you can't really control it like in After Effects. At least you can control and track an object to have a lens flare and stuff like that. So typically I won't mess with this. So I'll uncheck that, and color controls, I'll uncheck that as well. So actually I didn't even cover LUTs. Let me go in there. LUTs are the best part about post effects here. And so LUTs, you might have played with it already, and I highly recommend that you do. You're probably yelling at me like, you didn't talk about LUTs. So LUTs are lookup tables. And let me just turn that back on. So LUTs are, if you click here and turn on like one of these, you can also arrow up or arrow down, and you can cycle through all of these LUT files. And basically what these are, just basically color transforms. They transform the colors in your image and give it a different look. So I almost relate these to like Instagram filters, right? So if you want to apply a nice Instagram filter to this, you can do exactly that. One of my favorites that I use a ton is this Contraste Soft. It's very European, like French, with the little E there. It just sounds way more classy than just contrast. And this is just a soft contrast. You can control the LUT strength here. So if you just want a little bit of the LUT, you can just bring that down. I also like to do this as well, which it just makes a little bit of a difference. And what this is allowing you to do is apply all the color management, so all the optical and stuff. It's going to apply all those effects and then apply the LUT on top of it. So it's just adjusting the order in which everything's getting applied. And so just that, I actually like it with that LUT in there, but we can apply this LUT in post. So I'm going to actually keep that off. Okay. But LUTs are a great thing. If I'm just rendering straight from After Effects, I always have some type of LUT. You can go online and find free LUTs all over the place too. That apply like really nice look. Some are subtle. Some are like beat you over the head with some of the stuff there. Okay, so those are LUTs. They actually deserve their own spotlight anyway. So I'm not mad that I kind of skipped them over, but they got their due. Okay, if you did want to render out with all these things, you would just keep these on and render out your image, which again is what we've been doing this entire course. But if you don't want to bake everything in, and you're, say, working with a client, which heaven forbid they ask for some changes, you want the most amount of flexibility to control all the different aspects of your image. So things like, oh, can we actually pump up the reflection in the scene? Can we actually brighten the image? Can we just add a glow to the laptop screen there? All these things, if you bake everything in, like you can't change it down the road. You would have to re-render everything. So there's a smarter way to work when you know that you're going to work with a client. You're going to want some changes. You're going to want that flexibility. And I'm going to be showing you this workflow that kind of accommodates for that. But if you are just, doing it for the gram and you want to upload something to social media real quick, these options are perfect. Just do it, call it a day. But let's go and cover what we can do to have that maximum amount of flexibility in post. Okay. And so what we're going to be working with, if I go into my render settings here, to be able to, basically get out all the information, get out all the reflections, have them as a separate pass so I can control them, adjust the lighting if I want to in a separate pass, the subsurface scattering, all that stuff. All of those different controls is called an AOV, or arbitrary output variable. And if you set up your AOVs, you can render out all those different aspects of your render into different sections and can control each of those different aspects of your render in post. So in something like After Effects. And so to set up those AOVs, you are going to go and make sure you are in Redshift. I'm just going to uncheck the post effects. So we got Redshift post effects. I'm unchecking that. Back to AOVs. So if we want to set up our AOVs, we're going to go to the Redshift menu, going to go to Advanced, and you can see, you probably didn't notice this before, there's this little AOV tab right here. And so I'm going to go into that. There's all of this kind of information here. And so we've been rendering at just a normal PNG at this point. And typically in the past, if you want to render out all these different layers before Redshift, you would actually render out what's called a multipass image. And a multipass is basically each layer. So a reflection layer, a specular layer, all of those things were called multipass. And now that Redshift is kind of integrated into Cinema 4D, we don't actually need to use the multipass system in Cinema 4D because we can use the Redshift AOV system to render out all those different layers. So I'm going to uncheck that. And then you can see here is our regular image. But if we want to render out AOVs, we can go into AOVs, bring out all the different layers. And the great part about this is we can save it as a single file. So if I have a image sequence, I don't actually have to render out an image sequence that just contains the specular information, another one that just contains the reflection, another one that contains the subsurface scatter, all that stuff. You can actually, if you check this button on, this will actually create an EXR file. And an EXR file is the file you should use if you're doing any type of compositing, because it allows you to go from the limits of like 16-bit depth, that is what a PNG is limited to. It allows you to go to 32-bit depth. So what that allows you to do is have a lot more color information in your image that you can then do a lot more color correction on and without losing a lot of detail. So it's kind of like if you were recording in RAW format and you just have all that color information in there that you can really start pushing things and doing color correction without doing too much overexposure and overbright, all that kind of stuff. So long story short, you're always going to want to render out a multi-party XR because that is going to contain all of those different layers like reflection, subsurface, all your AOVs. It's going to be in one file, which is great. Okay. So you don't have to render out multiple sequences or anything like that. Everything is stored in one file. And so there are these different settings here that basically allow you to balance file size with quality. And so this half float here is one way to optimize your EXR file for speed and quality. Another thing you can do is adjust the compression. And usually I will change this to, for motion graphics-y stuff, I'll change this to DWAB because it's fun to say. And it's just what you would use. It's, again, a good balance of quality and file size. If you were doing like hardcore VFX stuff and you didn't want any compression at all, you would use zip. Okay, it's going to be a big file size, but it's also going to not have any quality loss at all. But I'm not doing any heavy VFX here, so I'm going to do some dwabbing. And then everything else here is all good. So I only changed the multi-party XR. And then here's your base file name. This is where you're going to actually save your file, and it's going to actually save it in the same area that you choose here. Okay, so if I go and I'll just render it here, so I'll just name this test, sure. Name this in the test folder. And what you can do here is you see this little $ PRJ. So this is what's called like a render token. And it's just a little bit of code that basically pulls information from your scene and adds it to a render. So what this means is anytime you put $PRJ in your render, it is going to name it or replace this $PRJ with the name of your project. So right now it's going to say like, okay, your AOV file, that's going to be a multi-party XR, it's going to save it as whatever your project name is, _ AOV. Okay, so that's fine. I'm going to leave it as that, but I just wanted to show you what that $PRJ is. So I can even do that here as well, where I can say, I can enter in here, and you actually go to this little menu here and say project name, and then I'll actually add that PRJ automatically for you, and I can do _. Okay, so really handy, all these different render tokens here. Okay, and let's go back to Redshift, and now we have to set up our AOVs. Okay, so we set up the file format, where it's going to be saved, all that kind of stuff. Let's go and actually define what passes we want to render out separately. So let's go and open up this show AOV manager, and you can see it pops up this new window, and you can see over here all of these different available AOVs that we can use. And some of these might sound very familiar. Some of these might sound very foreign. So we got global illumination, shadows, emission, all this type of stuff, puzzle mats, a lot of crazy stuff. The only thing I'm going to tell you is that for a basic composite, you only need some very common AOV passes. And also it's dependent on what you have in your scene. Okay. So I will have for your full render, you can add a beauty pass. And a beauty pass is basically what you render out anyways. It's all of your effects. It's all that stuff already baked in. So I'll add that because what we'll do is we'll check our composite to the actual beauty and see if it matches, because it should match perfectly. And then next up, if we have some type of depth, we will add that as well. So if we want to add in depth of field blur in post, we can do that. Let's do emission. So I do have a material with emission on it. So if I go to my laptop here and twirl this down, and let's see, the laptop screen should be here somewhere, but there is here's the screen material there. There we go. And you can see that this school of motion image, I'm actually pumping into the emission here as well. And so anytime you have emission on a material, it will not render out unless you go into your AOVs and say, hey, render out the emission there as a different pass. So this will have that emission as a separate pass, which is great because we can isolate it and add some glows to it in post, okay? Next up, global illumination. We definitely have global illumination going on in our scene. We do have diffuse lighting. So this is going to be all of your lighting information. That's going to be on its separate layer, so you can control the amount of light in your scene. You can also get motion vectors. So this is going to allow you to control motion blur in post. So I'll add that. And one important thing I want to kind of call out is that if you're rendering your blurs in post, you want to make sure you're actually not rendering your blurs baked into your render. So make sure your motion blur is disabled, and also make sure in your camera that your bokeh is off. Okay, you don't want to actually bake in your blurs and then apply blurs in post. You don't want to blur it twice, right? Blur inception. So now we will have our reflections. So that'll be reflections in another pass. And so these are actually just reflections of objects onto other objects. And if we actually wanted the reflections of lights on our objects, that is actually a specular lighting pass. So you need both, because reflections is just objects reflecting other objects showing up. Specular lighting is objects reflecting the lights in the scene. Next up, we can control the shadows. So I'll grab a shadows pass, and refraction I will add because I have glass materials in here. And if you have any glass materials with transmission, you'll have refractions and you'll want to have that show up. And that looks like it's basically it. I need subsurface scattering. So I have some materials with some subsurface scattering. And here is for the pug body. You can see in my material here, I have subsurface scattering active. So if you have any material in your scene that has subsurface scattering, be sure to render out the subsurface scattering here, or it just won't render at all, okay? Notice that these are all checked as multipasses. And remember, we are not going to be using the Cinema 4D multipass system. We are going to be using the Redshift AOV system. So I'm going to say, okay, render all these passes directly through Redshift, okay? And so now when you do that, I can click on each of these different passes and I can actually control what type of file or format the beauty pass comes through as. The Z depth, I can control different things about that. And actually there is a little bit of cleanup I need to do here, because when you're rendering out your depth pass and your motion vector pass, there's a little bit of setup that you need to do. And so the filter type basically controls like anti-aliasing quality. And I found that if you use the center sample, it's a little bit better. So choose that. And then how the depth pass is actually calculating your depth of field is using your camera's near far settings. So what does that mean? So let me close this out. If I go to my camera and I go to the object tab, you can see there's these clipping values here. So near and far. And now this is actually what is going to drive the depth. Like, how deep should my scene be? You don't want this infinite depth, right? Because what depth is going to be portrayed as in post in its own pass is a black and white gradient. So you're going to have a gradient from things in focus that will be white and things that are out of focus, which will gradate to black, okay? So this is basically defining where is that 3D gradient in my scene. So if I go, let's close out of the material manager here. Let's look at our camera. And actually I'll keep up these two views. Let me go to arrangement, two views stacked. Okay, so we got our two views. Here's our overhead view. I'm going to turn on the far clip plane, and this is at 10,000. Let me actually bring this to 1,000, and you can see that little line there. So this is the furthest our scene will go, and this will make a little bit more sense if I just kind of move the camera focus to the actual laptop. And you can see there is the clip plane. So if I move this forward, you can see this is actually clipping out. Look up here, clipping out some geometry in my scene. So the whole point of this clip plane is to basically optimize your viewport. And so if there's anything off screen, things that are too far away or too close, you can actually clip that from actually being calculated in your render. And so this is what that's for, but it's also happens to be used as a control for Z depth, which I know is a little weird. And so you can see if I control the near plane, you're getting this little plane here in front. And if I go a little bit too close, it's going to start cutting away at our scene. So you definitely don't want that. But basically what you're going to do is say, okay, this is the front of my scene. That's where the blur starts. And the back of my scene will be like right here. And so this will actually move with the camera, okay, which is nice. And so once you have this set up, that's all you need to do. You actually don't want to clip out things from your scene. So I will go and just uncheck these. These will still, these numbers, these values will still be used in the depth of field, but we know that that's set up now. So let's go back to our AOVs. Show AOV manager. And so another thing we can check, so that's all set up. We got our camera near far. Another thing we can check is motion vectors. And this area here, this max motion, if you have a lot of motion, a lot of fast moving objects in your scene, you want to up this number. Otherwise, you can kind of bring this down. If you like, we have a lot of subtle movement here. So you could actually bring this down if you wanted to like 6. But if you have a lot of fast moving stuff, you'll want to up this. Okay, so it's kind of like a threshold. And so this is all good. So now we can kind of test and make sure that we have everything working fine. And we can do a preliminary check by going to our Redshift render view here and firing off a render. Let me close out of the post effects here. And so here is our scene. And you'll notice one thing right here is that we have, this is our beauty pass, right? So remember I added the beauty AOV here. Get to my AOV manager here and just kind of position it right here. Okay, so we got everything right here. And if we go to this drop-down menu here, you can see all of the different passes that we can look at and see what they look like in our render view here. So our preview render. So that's our beauty. That's going to be our fully compositive with all the reflections, all the subsurface scattering, all of these different things that are already composited together. That will be in our beauty pass. So again, that was what we've been rendering this whole entire time. It's just called a beauty pass because it's so beautiful. Now to see the depth, we need to go and do a bucket render. And so I'll turn that on. And depth's weird because depth has so much over bright information in it that we can't see, that if you were to render this, it would only render and show up as white. You're not going to see anything in there, but we can extract the information and see that full gradient in post. But just to say, like, you won't be able to see anything in this depth pass. You will be able to see something in the motion vector here. And you can see this like kind of, like to say baby puke green. And motion vectors, what is it? Just like I was saying, how what's in focus and what's out of focus is a grayscale information, kind of like a bump map. You can see that bump maps and stuff like that are grayscale based. The motion vector is almost like a normals, where normals is like you got the RGB to say what's in what different direction, what dimension it's getting pushed out in. Motion vectors, it's color coded by green or orange, and then like a spectrum of yellows and stuff like that in between to say whether something's moving or not, and to control the amount of motion blur. So again, we really don't have anything moving all that fast, so we're not going to see too much show up in this pass. But just to know that the depth pass and the motion vector pass, you can only see it if you're doing this bucket rendering thing here. So now let's actually go and check out our diffuse lighting. And so we can check out these different passes. So remember, diffuse lighting is all the light information that is being applied to the surfaces of your object. So this is going to have all of your light information that you can control. We got the emission, which again is going to show up any material that has that emission part of it active. So you can see that there's like the keyboard keys have a little bit of emission in the material, same with the screen. So that's looking good. We have our GI, global illumination happening here. We have our reflections. So again, objects reflecting off of other objects. If we look at the refractions, you can see, because these are behind glass, that's going to show up in the refraction pass. We have the subsurface scattering, which I have some of the leaves have some subsurface scattering and the body of the pug. So I actually accidentally forgot to render out the subsurface scattering. And I saw in my render, like, wait, where are the leaves texture? Because this just rendered out as black, like the body of the pug. And I was like, what happened? I was like, oh, I forgot a pass. So this is great to make sure that you check everything. There's our shadows. And then specular lighting, again, that is the reflection of lights on objects, okay? And so that looks like those are all the passes that we possibly have. And so at this point, we tested it. Everything is looking good in our Redshift render view. But what I always recommend you do before you start rendering an animation or a sequence, render out a single frame and see what it looks like. And composite it in After Effects or whatever compositing app you're using and see if it checks out. And if it does, then render the full animation. So let's do that test right now. So I'm going to go to save. I'll save the regular image, should be like a PNG, right? Go to output. I'm rendering at 1920 by 1080. Current frame is, let's have this, something like that. Looks good. So current frame 80. And we have the post effects turned off. All this is set up and we can go and render a single still. So let's go to render and we'll let this do this thing and come back when this is done. And I'll go ahead and open this rendered image inside of After Effects and let's test and see how it looks. Now, one thing I want to bring up real quick is notice right when this bucket is done rendering, wait for it, it's going to apply all those color transforms and it's going to look exactly like it did in its render view. That's a bunch of color management stuff that's happening behind the scenes. And we're going to get into a little bit of color management here. It's going to get a little bit geeky, but it's only stuff that you need to know as a motion designer because we're all, I don't know, I'm not going to be working at ILM as a VFX artist and need to know all this like color management information. But there is a bunch of different ways of trying to make sure that what you're rendering out of Cinema 4D is consistent color-wise with how you view it in other applications. So that's why there's going to be a little bit of this type of color management that we'll need to do. So our image is rendered out of Cinema 4D. I got a single still. Let's bring it into After Effects and see how it looks. All right, so here we are in After Effects, and I'm just going to go and do New Project. And then I'm just going to double click the little project area over here. So these are what got rendered out when I rendered out that single still. So we have that EXR file that has all of those different passes, the multi-layer EXR file, remember. This has all of our passes in it. We also rendered just a PNG just to have. That is basically what our final render should look like when we composite all of our passes together using this EXR file. The only thing is, the EXR file, we can control all those different layers in post, which is the whole point of the EXR file and the multipass and the AOVs and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to select just this EXR file for now. And I'm going to make sure that this creates a composition. Now, if I rendered a sequence of the entire animation, I need to make sure that I have this checked on so it's imported as a sequence. So I'm going to go ahead and hit import, and this little dialog box is going to come up. And you really don't have to change anything here. What I'm going to do is keep this as importing as a composition. We are going to pre-compose the layers and we're going to create a contact sheet with it. And what's great about this EXR import is that all of the different setting up all the individual layers in a comp is already done for you with this workflow. So I'll leave everything as it is, make sure it's imported as a composition. I'll click OK. and you're gonna see we got this folder. If I twirl that down, you can see we have 2 comps. We have a contact sheet, which if I double click on that, you can see it's just a contact sheet of all of the different renders here. So I can click on the specular lighting here, and you can see that's its own comp, and that's the actual specular lighting. So these are all those different passes we saw in Cinema 4D, okay? The only thing is that this motion vector looks a little bit weird, almost looks like a depth pass, and motion vectors actually won't render out very well if it's just a single still. It needs that motion. So the motion vector pass we're actually not gonna use in this instant. The depth pass we can totally use, but the motion vectors we're not really gonna worry about until we render out the full animation. But motion vector, it's doing something, so we know it's on. So you can see all these different passes, and then if we click on this assemble, which makes me, anytime I see assemble, reminds me of like the Avengers or something like that. These are all of your different passes that we can start compositing together using blending modes and rebuilding our main image, our beauty pass. So our beauty is all the way on the bottom. Let's bring this to the top. And this is what the beauty pass looks like. You can see everything looks really dark. And that's because, again, you have to do certain things to maintain and ensure that how your render looks in Cinema 4D is also how your render looks and how your colors look in other applications. So sometimes, in the case of After Effects, you actually have to change some settings to ensure that it's using the same color management setup as you were in Cinema 4D. So to do that, I'm gonna go into this little menu here. And so we have 32 bits per channel, which is perfect. The engine is OCIO. This OCIO configuration needs to be this ACES 1.3 CG version 1. If you make sure you have that, that's using the same configuration that we used in Cinema 4D. So if I go and click OK, you'll see, boom, our image looks exactly the same as it was. So just a little bit of housekeeping there to make sure that you're using the same color management system as was being used in Cinema 4D and using the same one over here, okay? So just one little change that we had to do, just change that to ACES 1.3 and we're looking good. So this is our beauty pass. I'm gonna turn this off because we are gonna composite and compare it to this image and it should look exactly the same. First up, our image just goes white, and this is because this is our depth pass, our Z depth pass. So I'm just gonna actually move this all the way to the bottom, turn it off, and I'll also remove my motion vectors and bring that to the bottom as well. So our bottom layer is gonna be the diffuse lighting, and then all of these different layers, the order in which things are stacked, you can see that the shadows are here below the specular lighting. That is by design. This is how you should actually stack your passes in this order. Okay, so this is the great thing about the CXR setup is that it already does it for you. You don't have to guess like, wait, does subsurface scattering go above or below GI? It's already set up. You don't have to touch it, okay? But if you were gonna rebuild this from scratch in another application, this is what you should reference. So the shadows should definitely go below the specular lighting, all this kind of stuff. Now, I'm gonna turn off shadows for right now because I just wanna deal with all of these, essentially what are passes that are adding light to the scene. So specular lighting, that's adding light to the scene. Refractions, adding light by reflecting it. GI, adding light. All of these different passes, if I select all these passes are adding light to our diffuse lighting base layer here. And so I'm saying add a lot. To make sure that this looks correct, you would actually use the add blending mode to correctly composite all of these passes together. So I'm gonna hit add, voila, look at that. Let's actually turn this beauty on. And you see there's just a slight little gamma change there, what looks like a gamma change, but if something's completely off, like remember I used that subsurface scattering and I forgot to render subsurface scattering. This is what my render looked like. And I'm like, uh-oh, that doesn't look right. So I would have to go in like, oh, I forgot to render out my subsurface scattering. And so this is a great way to check that did I miss rendering out a pass? And this is how you can kind of check that. So this is looking pretty dang close to our beauty pass here. And I just want to show you what's going on behind the scenes because you might be wondering, how am I getting all this information from just a single image, a single still image file? And so what I want to do, if we go to the reflections here, you can see there is our EXR file, right? And if I go to the effect controls, you can see there's this extractor effect. And what the extractor effect can do is basically extract all that AOV pass information from the single file. And what After Effects did was took all those different layers and broke them all into their own comps and already did all this work for us. So we didn't have to go in here and choose the RGB channels of the GI and everything. It's already done for us, which is really great. So that's what's going on behind the scenes. And so now at this point, we can go into our specular lighting and let's do like an exposure effect here. And we can, you know, the client's like, hey, pizzazz up the lighting. We can go to the exposure and kind of bring up everything a little bit. And so there's exposure, which basically is just kind of bringing things up. And then there is gamma. So let me just, let me right click on this and reset. And then there's gamma, which adds a little bit more contrast. And so I usually use these two settings to adjust things, but I just want to demonstrate what gamma and all that stuff is doing. So let me get a new solid and okay. And then let's apply a gradient or a ramp. Is it a ramp? Yeah, gradient ramp. I was right on both times. And I'll just kind of do this. And where's the end of the ramp? Right there. And so what's going on here, if I apply an exposure on top of that, see how the exposure just kind of either brings the grayscale values to the left or the right, depending on what you're doing. So that's handling color one way. Gamma is basically like just making contrast. And so you're handling information somewhat differently when you are using either gamma or exposure. Just reset that back to 0. So just wanted to demonstrate that. So we got our specular lighting, control that. I will go to, say, the subsurface scattering. Let's throw an exposure on that as well. And remember, that is controlling the leaves and the pug there. So you can really crank that up and see what's going on. It's like a radioactive pug. And so you can kind of adjust things there, add a little bit of contrast. You can even do like a, hue saturation if you wanted to, throw it on here and, make it a green alien pug, something like that. So you can adjust things like that, adjust the saturation of the subsurface scattering there. And so you can kind of see the before and the after, just slight. Less is more a lot of times with this stuff. And so we can go into things like reflection. And let's do an exposure here too. You can see that we're really bringing up the reflection strength there. So this is something that you wouldn't be able to do if you just rendered out a PNG file. I mean, basically when you render out a PNG file, the only thing you really do is a simple curves adjustment. Okay, so nothing too exciting there. And the emission here, we can add an exposure to here too. See, that's controlling the screen and the keys that have the emission activated on those materials. This is really great. One thing we can do here is add a little bit of glow. So we can add some glow, add our glow in post. And you can see that we can add a little bit of glow like so, 0.2. And so you can see, got that glow going on, okay? So this is kind of why you would render everything in post, because if you render this out, client's like, that's too much glow. Or actually what they would say is we need much more glow and do something like that. And they're like, perfect. Why do we say, clients are not that dumb. They're not that dumb, right? Sometimes, but not most of the time. Most of them are kind of smart people, right? Okay, so apologies if you are a client yourself. I don't know. So let's go and let's talk about adding our blurs. So we got our glow. Well, actually, let's talk about our LUTs. So remember we turned off our LUT. So what I'm going to do to add in a LUT in post is go to new adjustment layer. And I will just type in, rename this LUT. And then if I type in LUT here, I can say apply color LUT and apply that effect. And this is going to bring up a dialog. And I actually have this my favorite LUT right here that I can load up. And this is going to apply that same LUT information to this and apply it as an adjustment layer. So if I wanted to control the strength like I did in Cinema 4D, I can hit T for the opacity and just adjust the strength of the contrast, right? So looking good. Now, as far as applying your blurs, I'm not going to mess with the motion vector, but the Z pass, that's how we can extract the depth information. And so for that, I actually need to do one thing to this pass. And if I double click on this to open up the depth here, you can see that it's all white. But you can see in the little info panel, there's actually RGB information there, and it's like 4E, 7E. This is all over bright areas of our image because this is going beyond the white that we can visually see. And so what we actually need to do in this pass is just select this layer, or select the CXR file layer, and then go into this extractor and adjust the white point. So if you just adjust this a little bit, you can see, oh, there is our little gradient there, and I can adjust the black point there. And so what you want to do is just get a nice smooth gradient from dark to light going throughout your scene. So you want to try to see like what's in that back wall, because there's the painting there. So you want to make sure you're applying that gradation to everything. And so you can kind of, so you can set this to 0. See if I can just get this. I might have to adjust both here. But I think that's looking pretty good. Just want a nice gradient like so. And let's see if this is good enough to control the depth of field. So what I'm going to do is go to my scene start here. Let's actually rename this to just composite. There we go. So it's not just a big long name there. And what we can do to apply the depth of field blur to our comp here is, again, adding a new adjustment layer. And I'll just rename this DOF. And then for the depth of field, I'm going to use this camera lens blur that's actually built into After Effects. There is a better blur that I would recommend you get. It's a plugin called Fast Bokeh Pro. You can get it off of AE Scripts and Plugins. It's only $50. If you have a setup where you know you're going to be doing a lot of this type of work and you want to be adding this depth of field blur in post, because say you have a slow computer or something like that, you can't bake in depth of field with Cinema 4D or with Redshift, highly recommend this because it's a lot better than the built-in depth of field here. So just a fair warning that this camera lens blur has its limitations. So we have this blur. It's currently applying blur to our entire scene. We need to make sure it's actually using the Z depth. So if I go to the Z here, using that Z depth to control what's in focus and what's not. You can see that, actually that looks pretty good. How you can control what the focal point is by using this blur focal distance. And so it'd be great if you could just just select an area on your image to do that, which the Fast Bokeh Pro actually does allow you to do. But you can control the radius and really crank that up. And I recommend to crank it up really high. And then I'm going to hold the Control or Command key down and really just dial in here in very small amounts to make sure that, actually I missed it. So it's very touchy sometimes. So you can see this edge is in focus. Okay, now this is in focus. Okay, so that's looking good. And let me push it a little bit forward. And so now you can see that the motion's more in focus. And this is looking good. Now, if I zoom in here, you can see this looks like hot garbage. And so if you have a render that you really want to get this super shallow depth of field, bake it in. Just bake it in Cinema 4D. There's really no good way to get around heavy depth of field looking good in post, because you're going to get all these artifacts and stuff like that. But what this workflow is great for is if you just need a little bit, even a little bit, you get this weird fringing going on, which is not great. So usually it's like you just want a subtle amount of depth of field, and this looks okay. Okay, so again, the built-in camera lens blur, not great. That fringing really doesn't happen that much with that Fast Bokeh Pro. So just highly recommend you get it. It's worth the $50. But this, you don't have to buy it if you don't want to. You can use this camera lens blur. And so this is looking pretty good. So we got our LUT. Let's add some more glow. So if we wanted more of that like bloom that happened to all of our image and not just what's emitted, it has emission on it, we can go to our specular lighting and add a glow effect to that. So glow. And so now you can see, we bring the threshold down and the glow radius up. This is basically that bloom effect that we were doing in render, but now we're doing it in post. We didn't bake it in. We have the flexibility to add this back in. We can, control the tint like we could over there as well, right? So a little something like that. And so glow on, glow off. Okay. So that's how you can do that in post. Oh, one other thing that's kind of interesting is our Z pass. See how it looks kind of like fog? So you can actually use your Z pass and, whoops, I could change the adjustment or change the blending mode, and you can get a little bit of like, hey, it's a really foggy room there, right? So that's kind of cool. And again, you can actually duplicate this whole comp and adjust those min-max levels to adjust where that fog is in your scene. So actually, let me show you how to do that real quick. So here's our Z comp. I'm just going to duplicate that. I'll just name this Z fog. And so let's actually move this down, turn that off. Whoops, wrong one. There we go. And then we can control, like, where's that fog at? So maybe the fog is just in the back, right? And so we can go back to our composite. Let's bring in that Z source. Or actually, nope, Z fog. I keep messing it up. I named it to remove confusion, and I'm just confusing myself. And so now I will hit the shift key and the plus sign and do lighten. You can do add, screen, and then just, So if it's a very foggy day in your office, yeah, you can add fog. This is great if you're doing environments or something like that. Not so great if it's an indoor scene, unless something's on fire. You're rendering and something's on fire, you might have a little fog. Anyways, so here is our single still looking good. Let's see what this looks like before compositing and after. So just a little bit, we tweak some stuff. So we know that everything looks good, right? So what I'm going to do is go back to Cinema 4D, render out the entire sequence. So that will give us the whole EXR sequence. And let's come back and I'll show you, once I replace all these files with the fully rendered version, see what that looks like and test out that motion vector pass to add the motion blur. So if you were going to render everything out and you already had your sequences, we'll go to the replace footage and you'll replace this footage with the entire EXR sequence. So you'd want to make sure you check that on. But I'm going to go and render out this full sequence and I'll catch you in just a few seconds. All right, so here we have our fully rendered sequence. You can see I added a little curves adjustment layer on top of this as well. And I wanted to show you a little bit more things you could do in post, because I didn't show you how to do the motion vector, the motion blur, and I didn't show you what to do with the shadows here. So let me just go and turn on shadows real quick. See, this looks really weird. So notice how we added all of the different light base passes that add light to the scene. We use that add blending mode. Now, shadows, they don't add light to the scene, they actually take away. So what we can actually do, we can do two things. We can use multiply and really dial this back. And you can see we can add some shadows, add some darker shadows there. Or we can actually remove shadows. If you want to lighten the shadows, what you would actually do is do exclusion and bring this back. And so you can slowly bring away some of the shadow information and lighten everything up. So you can see the before and after. So if you want to remove and lighten up some of the shadows, use exclusion. If you want to darken the shadows, use multiply. There you go. And so I think I want to just darken the shadows a little bit, add a little bit of contrast, and do a very subtle amount. So before, after, looking good. Okay. And next thing we can do is, remember I showed you how you can add a vignette in the post effects, the Redshift post effects. We can do that very easily in After Effects as well. So again, new adjustment layer. I'll handle this by using a new adjustment layer, and we'll name this vignette, and then just bring this on up, and we'll just go and add an exposure, and we'll bring the exposure down like so. And so now we can create a mask to, you know, control where this the vignette is. And so we'll grab our pen tool. And so I don't like to do, you know, just get your ellipse tool and blah, because that's too perfect. Nothing in nature is that perfect. So I like to add a little bit more art directed vignette. And really a vignette helps you lead the eye to what's important in your scene, because it's I guess it's a form of lighting, you know? And so what you could do is say, all right, let's have the vignette kind of darken out some of the least important parts of our image, but keeping this area bright. And so this mask is working inversely to what we want. So let's just go to the mask here, click invert, and then twirl this down, and we'll up the feather. We can adjust the expansion in or out. And so the darker areas are things that are just not that important, like the bookshelf back here. We definitely want this, because this is awesome. We want that in there. I added a new point there accidentally. And so we got this in light, and then actually this wouldn't make sense for this area to be in vignette because it's being lit there. So bring that up. And so this is nice because you can kind of control where your vignette is. So before, after, just a really subtle effect. Maybe bring that up a little bit just to help you lead the eye into the scene. It's the whole point of a vignette, right? So that's looking good. And actually, I forgot to add in that LUT again. So if you wanted to add the LUT back in, we could do that. I'm not really concerned with the LUT though, but this capital I is annoying me. Fixed it. All right. So let's go and let's talk about how we can get that motion vector in there. And let's actually look at what that motion vector looks like. And so see, right? The only thing that's moving, everything's technically moving in the scene because there is that camera move. But when you actually have something moving very fast, notice how it's a brighter color than everything else. So those are those color codes of like what's speeding up, that's green, what's slowing down, that's orange. Okay, and so that's how you can use this motion vectors pass to add motion blur on top of it. Now, the unfortunate thing is, again, that there are some built-in things that help you fake motion blur that are built into After Effects. And let me actually just show you real quick. So here's an adjustment layer. Name this Mo Blur. And we'll go and search for blur again. And so what you could do is use pixel motion blur. And you can see that this is doing a little bit better job, but it is super, super janky. We can up the samples here. It's a little bit better, but this looks like garbledy-gook. Now, this probably won't pass especially if you have a lot of fast-moving stuff. So I'm going to delete that as well. Now, there is yet another thing I'm going to recommend to you that you buy. I know it's a pain, but hey, or you just buy a faster computer. You don't have to mess with this stuff, all right? So Real Smart Motion Blur, Revision Effects, something I've had for years and years and years now. I bought it once years and years ago, and I still have that same license. So that's kind of the nice thing. You buy it once, you have it forever. So Real Smart Motion Blur adds really nice motion blur. I mean, they use it in films and stuff like that. So it's kind of like, it's kind of the industry standard if you're doing this type of work in After Effects. So I actually have that installed. So I'm going to go in here, and you can see here is my revision plugins. And so the version you'll want is the Real Smart Motion Blur Pro Vectors, because we want to use those motion vectors. So I'll just bring that in there like so. Looking great. everything looks perfect. That's what our scene looks like. Final, let's render it out. No. We actually need to define the motion vector source, which is our motion vectors layer there. And now you can see this still looks like doo-doo, but it's a little bit closer. So you just don't apply the effect and say you're done, because every render is different. And so it's applying different levels of blur depending on what your render is and how fast your objects are moving. So we got this blur amount, then we have this displace, which is very touchy. Like this, I just clicked it and it went up 1,000. So I'm going to move this to like 50. And so you can see that's basically, you know, increasing the amount of blur and where it's going. I'm going to adjust these scales to like, so this is like the scale of blur in the X. This is in the Y. You can see that these are just way too high. So I'm going to do like 0.5, 0.5. And this max displace, that's just, you know, again, something you should probably do very subtle amount, like something like that. And then we can up this blur amount. And so you can see that, you know, even this is kind of slightly off. But if we were to RAM preview this in motion, it's kind of like an optical illusion. It actually looks all right. But again, if you have a lot of things moving very fast in your scene, you want it to look accurate, you just bake it in. You're going to need to render out your motion blur in Redshift. And you know, the good thing is it's a lot faster to render these types of blur effects in render using Redshift in the modern renders than it was when I was cutting my teeth in the industry. You add on your depth of field blur, your motion blur, it would, like, I'll see you next week. We'll see how those first 50 frames look like next week. All right. So this is a lot faster to do. So I really recommend that, you know, if you do need the flexibility, here's what you can do, but highly, highly recommend that you just bake your blurs in, get a fast enough machine. If you're really going to consider doing a lot of 3D work, you just can't get around not having a beefy computer with some really nice GPUs if you want to do this level of 3D work. If you're just doing a little bit here and there, probably don't need it. But if you really want to jump in the 3D, both your feet into the 3D pool, you're going to want to invest in yourself, right? You're going to add 3D to your tool set, and you're going to demand the bigger bucks. And because you got more skills, it pays for itself, right? All right. So we got this looking good. We got our exposure. We have our motion blur, our depth of field blur. We got a vignette. We got our curves. We got exposure. We got all this stuff going on. Kind of composited everything back in here. Again, let's go before and after. Looking a little bit more better and ready to render this out. So there's one last important thing we need to be aware of, and that is actually making sure all the color management that we had from Cinema 4D to make sure that that color management applies and looks the same in After Effects. You also need to apply a bit of color management when you actually render from After Effects to a finished file like an MP4. Luckily, this is very, very easy to do. So let's go ahead and let's render out using the render queue. Okay, so I'm going to hit Command and Control M to add this to the render queue here. We are going to save this to, let's name this test render version 2 revision 4, because it can't just be 1, right? You got to go through all this. So we'll name it that. We're going to go to best settings, make sure everything's good here. The one thing you really have to keep in mind that I should have mentioned early on is that when you if you render out at 24 frames per second from Cinema 4D, you want to make sure that when you bring everything into Cinema 4D or into After Effects as a sequence, that you right click, go to interpret footage. Well, first you want to make sure that it says what your frame rate is here. If it says 30 frames per second when it should be 24, you want to right click on your sequence, go to interpret footage, main, and then just enter in the correct frame rate. And once you do that, you also need to make sure that your actual comp is 24 frames per second as well, or whatever frames per second it should be. So to change that, you're going to go to composition settings, and then just make sure your frame rate is set there. Okay. So once you have that all set, go to render queue, and we'll go into the output module. Now, typically you'll deliver as an MP4, but typically one thing I'll do is I will up this target bitrate to something a little bit higher. Now, as far as social media goes, things like Instagram and stuff like that, they have their recommended guidelines here. And I know After Effects, or actually Adobe Media Encoder, has their presets for it. But unfortunately, the only way we can render with the correct color management is through the render queue and not through Adobe Media Encoder. So it's very important that when you're compositing with Cinema 4D and you're compositing with After Effects afterwards, that you are continuing that same color management throughout. And the only way you can do that is through the render queue in After Effects, not Adobe Media Encoder, at least at this point in time, okay? And so we'll hit OK, that's all set up. There's one huge important thing we need to do in this menu, and that is to go over to the color options of the output module settings. And this, if you rendered out just with the default settings here, your render will look dark. And I've seen forums all across the internet that this is a common thing, is that when everything looks right in After Effects, but the moment you render it out, it looks dark. And that's because you're not applying the same color management to ensure that all those color transforms are happening, so that what you're using in After Effects is also what is being used when you render that file. So we had color transform coming from Cinema 4D, or color management from Cinema 4D to After Effects. You also have color management from After Effects to render. And so two things: I need to make sure you have Show All turned on. And then in here, you are going to check this sRGB Display Aces 1. Now, you will not see this if you don't have Show All checked on. So make sure you have Show All checked on, and then choose this, and you should be all good. Now, another thing you should check as well is that we changed this right when we made our project, but just in case you forgot, you always want to make sure that you change this OCIO, that this is not Adobe Color Management, but OCIO, and this configuration is ACES 1.3. Now, these are things you can easily forget. I mean, I only know all this stuff because someone at Maxon told me that, hey, this is what it needs to be. So I'm relaying that to you as well. You have to understand what color management system is being used in your 3D app, and make sure that you are changing those settings if you are bringing all that information, all that color information via image into a compositing app. So those two things, and then everything should be all right. We are going to hit render, and we'll just let this go. And this is going to go pretty dang fast here. Look at that. Looking good. And so I'm going to bring up my little file manager here, and let's test to make sure that this file color looks the same as what we saw in After Effects. And if I make this smaller, looks about right, right? That looks good. Looks pretty dang similar. Okay, so now that's the right way to do it, right? Now, if you forgot to do all that color management stuff, and let's just say you went to this, actually, let's just do this from scratch. Hit Command and Control M. We're going to do target. Let's do 45, and then hit OK. And then let's go to color. And you did not change this. Remember, you need to show all. You're not going to see what you need. So show all. You did not do this. Okay. You just left that as default. Let's render this once more and see what this looks like. And here it is. That's our assemble. That's what we just rendered out. This is what happens when you don't have the correct color management going. See how dark that looks compared to our original render? So it's very, very important you follow all these steps. And there's not a ton of steps, but they are things that you can't just import things into After Effects and use all the defaults. You have to know the right color management to use in these menus. So again, changing that from ACES 1.2 to 1.3, because we've upgraded, right? And then when you go to render, you use Show All, this. And this is specific to Cinema 4D and Redshift. If you're using a different renderer, like say Octane, it might be a little bit different. So you want to look up that information. If you're using Arnold or whatever, if you're using Blender, might be different with that as well. If you're doing compositing inside of After Effects or whatever compositing app of choice. So all those things need to keep in mind to do a little bit of flexible work in post So, and again, once you get the hang of this, it's going to be very, very easy to kind of replicate. But that is how you can get a render to go from this to this using AOVs, using Redshift, using Cinema 4D, using After Effects, compositing your motion blurs and your depth of field blurs in post. But again, if you have heavy depth of field, heavy motion blur, you're going to want to probably bake that inside of Cinema 4D. So you are going to be a compositing whiz after this. And just remember to charge your client more when they say to change. You're like, oh, I have to re-render the whole entire thing if you want me to up the reflection, or if you want me to add to a vignette. Oh my goodness, I got to render the whole thing. And it'll still be a secret between you and me. See you in the next video.